Okay, we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty, if you will, or the details of further delineating out the types of tests that are out there. So we've already talked about the kind of broad difference between tests and assessments. And the way I defined that was that tests are usually trying to measure what you already have learned or how successful you've been, while assessments are generally trying to predict into the future how well you'll do. So when we're looking at creating a test or using tests, we also want to recognize the stakeholders that are involved in the test. That includes the test developers. So tests are created for research studies, publications, commercially available instruments, or modifications of existing tests. So one of the stakeholders is who created the test. And there are many, many places using tests. Some of them actually are very proprietary. So for example, when I worked at Aon, we actually had what was called the ADEPT 15 personality test. It was a personality test with over 355,000 options within it. And we protected that very closely. It was basically a proprietary test, and it was one of the backbone products of what we provided people to use. We basically matched the ADEPT 15, which was a personality test, to hiring purposes. ETS, the GRE, all of these are examples of stakeholders being the test creators themselves. The test users are obviously stakeholders. So these tests are being used by a wide range of professionals within organizations, within universities, and within actually medical settings. The test taker, anyone who is the subject of an assessment or evaluation, is the person taking the test. Society at large is a stakeholder in testing. Test developers create tests to meet the needs of an evolving society. So basically, the idea here is that if people go to a university, we want to make sure they're learning the degree that they're focused on. If you're going to a training in the military, we want to make sure that you know how to do what you were trained on at the end of it. And when we hire people for various roles, police officers, EMTs, doctors, we want to make sure that they have the ability to do those jobs well. Engineers, plumbers, all of these are examples of the society being a stakeholder. And finally, other parties, organizations, companies, and governmental agencies that sponsor and develop the test. So all of these are, for example, stakeholders that are involved. Now, how important that's going to be depends on where you are in the testing process. In some cases, the test takers are obviously going to be almost always one of the most important parts because they're going to be taking the test. And a lot of organizations that I've worked with creating tests, that's one of the things they've been concerned with is how will the test takers react to the test? We want to make sure that it has face validity. In other words, that it feels like it is an accurate measure. So if you've ever taken a test or an assessment for a job and you asked yourself after you finished the assessment, what did that have to do with me being a dog walker? That's an example of low face validity. It didn't feel like it actually was measuring what would be important on the job. Now, sometimes it may still be a valid measure of whether you'd be a good dog walker, for instance, but that's an example of taking the stakeholders into account. Where the test came from, that's test developers. Those are the stakeholders again. So all of these can come into play. And it's a good idea when you're thinking about using a test, developing a test, or simply reviewing tests to think about who the stakeholders are in your intended use, how the test was created, who will be taking it, and how it will impact not only your organization, but society at large. So let's talk a little bit about the types of measurements that are often done in psychological tests and measurements. So one of the first types, at least historically speaking, were mental aptitude tests. Measuring the ability or intelligent quotient, so IQ, we don't really use that term anymore, but basically trying to measure intelligence. And we're going to get well into the weeds on how modern concepts of measuring intelligence have developed over the history of assessments, the fact that we've started to try to determine different types of intelligence. But generally speaking, whenever we're talking about a general intelligence test, often we refer to this now as a cognitive ability test, or G for short instead of IQ. The idea is that we're purporting to measure intelligence as a single overreaching construct. And it's actually one of the biggest measures that we often do in organizational assessment. So if we're hiring someone for a job, generally a part of that's going to be how smart are they? And by smart, I mean not only their ability to learn, but they're also their ability to be adaptive and make good decisions. So each test has a different number and different types of subsets that define what makes up that IQ or G. So some example tests include the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Kaufman Adult Intelligence Test, the Woodcock-Johnson, Letter International Performance Scale, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the Stanford-Binet, the Watson-Glaser. All of these are examples of intelligence tests, and some of them actually have many subtests. If you took the SAT, for example, or the ACT when you were in high school, you would probably have been it's subdivided into mathematical skill, reading and writing, and other subsets. That's the example. However, there's also an overall score. Educational aptitude and achievement test is another type of measure purporting to measure scholastic achievements and to predict academic success. And again, it's important to recognize here the difference between achievement versus aptitude. And this would kind of mirror what I talked about previously with test and assessment. If we're measuring educational ability, if we're looking at how well someone has learned something, in other words, it's at the end of the test, they've already learned and we're testing that knowledge, that's usually considered an achievement test. How much did they achieve in the goal of learning the material? If we're trying to measure how good they're going to be in the future, how good of a student they're going to be, how good they're going to be at graduate school, that is an aptitude test. Examples of achievement tests include the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, Stanford Achievement Test, Psychological Field Test, and the GED, General Educational Development Test. All of those are not necessarily measuring they're measuring what you've learned so far as a method of determining how well you'll continue to learn. So they purport to also try to measure your eventual educational success, but they're also measuring specifically what you learn. So if you look at the GED, it's actually about math, science, education. If you look at the psychological field test, it literally is a series of questions about how much you know about psychology. Examples of aptitude tests include the GRE, Graduate Records Exam, and the Miller's Analogies test. So these are basically trying to get at broader concepts of what you've actually learned, but not only that, but also what you can learn in the future. So your ability or your aptitude to learn more. Neuropsychological tests purport to measure brain activity as neurological abilities such as memory, pattern recognition, attention, and abstract thinking skills. Most often used to assess effects attributed to biological influences, so injury, aging, chemical. So, for example, if we were wanting to determine how much, for example, a certain alcohol affects your ability at memory, we might give someone a memory test while they are not inebriated. We might want to give them a memory test after 6 drinks. We might want to give them a memory test after 12 drinks. And we could use that to determine how alcohol affects your ability to remember. That would be an example of basically looking at chemical interactions. We might also look at it developmentally. So basically looking at someone, how is their ability to do abstract thinking as a 6-year-old versus a 12-year-old versus a 20-year-old? And then also, how does aging affect that as a 40-year-old, as a 50-year-old, as a 60-year-old, and onwards? We might also use it to determine injury. So we might not have a pre-test on someone, but we might know that they were fairly successful in their lives. They've sustained a brain injury, and we actually want to determine what impact has that had on their neurological abilities. And then once we have that baseline, as they improve or develop over time, or as we do interventions, do we see improvement? It's often used in conjunction with other ability tests. So when we look at neuropsychological tests, we might also be looking at personality, also decision making. And examples here can include the Wisconsin card sorting test, the Wechsler memory scale, the Bender visual motor gestalt test, and the Heisman yeah, I'm not even going to try that pronunciation, neuropsychological test battery. By the way, I'm not necessarily expecting you to memorize every single one of these tests. And one of the reasons to do the readings is the readings will give you a little more detail on what each one of these tests measure. But I really do want to get you to the reason for this is to give you a general feel for what's out there and the type of existing tests that are already in this area. So, for example, that one that I kind of messed up the pronunciation, the Halstead-Reiten, the Halstead-Reiten neuropsychological test battery actually is made to measure all sorts of types of neurological abilities. So, memory, pattern recognition. However, the testing kit itself is basically, if the last time I checked, I think it costs about $3,500. and involves a battery of tests that is supposed to be getting at the overall neuropsychological functioning of the person. Oh, there we go. There's the price the last time I checked this test out. By the way, that's probably about 10 years old, so assume it costs more now. So we also can be looking at personality assessments proposed to measure personality traits or individual differences. This can be used by clinical and counseling psychologists to kind of find out how well someone's functioning, to also give some kind of ideas of how their personality may assist or actually impede what they're trying to achieve in their lives. And again, it can be broken into the types of psychological measurements include objective versus projective. Objective tests are basically tests that are made to measure personality in a direct and easy to understand way. In other words, if you're taking the binge eating scale, the BES, you know you're taking the binge eating scale. It's very clear what's being measured, which also makes it very fakeable. If you're actually if you're taking the binge eating scale and you do binge eat, but you don't want people to know that you binge eat, it also is going to be fairly obvious the ways you should answer. Another example of an objective test, for example, is the personality factor questionnaire. So the 16PF is an example. And again, if you're trying to come across as more extroverted, it's going to be fairly easy for you to determine if a question asks you, I like to be the center of a party. If you're trying to get a higher score in extroversion, you're probably going to agree with that, whether or not you actually are. So generally, objective tests require the person to be honest as well. There's also the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and that's just another way to measure this. And we'll get into these individual tests when we talk about psychological measurements of personality. There's also projective tests. That includes the Rorschach's test that you're probably all familiar with from various psychological examples in pop culture, the House Tree Person test, the Thematic Appreciation test. The idea behind projective tests is it's not as clear what the right answer is. So it's a little harder to fake these. The problem with them is that often it's a little bit subjective as far as what you actually get. So for example, a recent research of the Rorschach test that was actually conducted found that different clinical psychologists, when given the exact same answer on a particular Rorschach slide, would actually interpret it in different ways. In other words, one person said that that meant they had a personality disorder. Someone else with the exact same response said, no, it doesn't. That means this is happening. So though there's been attempts to create better rules for using the projective test, the advantage and the allure of the projective test is that you can supposedly test personality without the person knowing what you're actually trying to measure, to make it harder to fake. The downside is that often they are less reliable and valid. In fact, Rorschach tests have been actually removed from use in court cases across the United States because they do not show reliable or consistent results. That doesn't mean that they can't be a useful tool in creating an overall psychological assessment of someone. It's just, as everything, there are advantages and disadvantages to every method of measurement. Vocational tests purport to measure occupational skills and interests. So most commonly used by career counselors, and typically they're more focused on measuring the interest than the skills themselves. Typically administered to high school students, but they can also be administered in other situations. Examples of these include the Armed Service Vocational Aptitude Battery, which includes a portion that looks at interest, the Strong Interest Inventory, the SII, the Jackson Vocational Inventory, and the Half Occupational Orientation Inventory. These are all examples. And they generally tend to break people into categories based on what they actually like. So for example, if you really are focused on art and you took the SII, the Strong Interest Inventory, it would probably come back and tell that you're basically more interested in artistic type occupations, and then would actually give you some examples. In my case, I would actually come across as realistic and social. So that's why I became a psychologist. I actually tend towards social behaviors, but I also tend to be very realistic, i.e. I like things to be very data driven and very factual. There's other ways to classify tests beyond what they're testing. That includes paper and pencil versus performance. So basically, are we actually having someone complete a test by answering questions in pencil to paper or in the internet on an online survey? Or are we actually measuring their performance? Are we putting them in a scenario or a situation that mirrors the real world and looking at their actual performance? Speed versus power. A speed test is basically a time test. How many questions can you answer in 10 minutes? A power test simply means that you have not necessarily an unlimited amount of time, but a reasonable amount of time for most people. So, for example, a speed test might be simple mathematical equations, and you've got 5 minutes to do as many as you can, but you're given 500 questions. There's no way you're going to do them all. So, it's not only accuracy, it's how many can you complete. If you think of a typing test is a speed test. You have 1 minute to type as many words as you can, and you're going to be looked at to see how many words you can type, your words per minute, but also checking to make sure you didn't make any errors. Power tests simply refer to tests that are actually effectively untimed. So when you take a test in a class, you're usually given, for example, 55 minutes or maybe an hour and a half to complete a test, which often will include 25 to 50 items, which gives you easily a minute or so per item, which is generally considered enough time to complete the test. That would be considered a power test. We can also look at whether you're taking the test individually or as a group. So an individual test usually means that one person takes the test, and usually that also means a fair amount of interaction from the person giving the test. It might be an interview, for example, one interviewer and one person being interviewed. A group means that a large number of people can complete the test at the same time. Maximum versus typical performance. Are we trying to measure someone at their best, or are we trying to measure someone at their typical? This can also be an example. So for an example of differences in tests. Typical performance is generally what we're interested within an organization, but maximum performance is what we're usually going to get. So let me talk about that for a second. If you're taking an actual assessment for the purposes of getting a job, you're probably going to be taking that test focused on succeeding, focused on doing well, and focused on presenting yourself at the best possible way. You want the job. You're going to try your very best. However, 6 months into the job is probably much more likely your typical performance. It's not going to be at maximal anymore. So this also becomes one of the dichotomies or one of the problems with testing is a lot of times when we give someone a test, we're going to get maximal performance. But what we're actually interested in is more typical performance. So one of the areas that testing also often examines is how can we get closer to actually measuring typical performance. And generally what that means is that we want to be able to give people multiple tests over multiple periods of time. So again, it's kind of the back and forth. There's no one easy way to do this. And finally, we can have a norm referenced versus a criterion reference test. A norm reference test means that it basically your performance is based on everyone taking the test at that time. So for example, if I was giving an exam in this class and there's 50 students and the top score was a 96, that 96, if norm reference, becomes the 100. That was the top score. That's the highest score someone could have. And everyone's score is going to be based on the range from the highest to lowest score. A criterion reference test means that 100 is 100. If the highest score gotten is an 80, that person still gets a low B. It's a criterion reference. In other words, it's based on something outside of the people actually taking the test. So if we think of this process, we can also start to kind of think about what various tests are going to be. So if you're taking a test in a class, it's a paper and pencil test. It's probably a power test. It's a group test. It is maximal performance. You know the test is coming. You can study for it. And it's generally criterion referenced. If we're actually doing a job, basically finding out if someone knows how to use a drill press in a job by having them actually do work on the drill press, that would actually be probably a performance test, power, again untimed, individual, one tester watching the person work on the drill press. It would probably again be maximal performance because they're trying to do their very best, but it would probably be norm referenced instead of criterion referenced. In other words, how well did this person do compared to the other people trying to actually get that job? Of course, computer-based testing has taken over in this field. In fact, this is an asynchronous class, so all the tests that you'll be taking here are computer-based tests. So computers can definitely assist in test administration, scoring, and interpretation. So scoring can be happening automatically on site. In other words, the computer already knows what the right answers are. It can also be done in central location. Assisted psychological assessments and computer adaptive testing have allowed for tailor-making tests with built-in scoring and interpreting capabilities. So for example, when you take a test in this class, though it's not computer assisted or computer adaptive, you are going to get a different, so everyone that takes the class is going to get the same 50 items. However, the order they get them and the order the questions are as far as their multiple choice, so there's an A, B, C, or D answer. So you may be getting a completely different order than the other person taking the test, and every question, even if question 7 is the same as question 9 for someone else's test, your answer may be A as the correct answer, while their answer might be C as the correct answer. So the test itself isn't changing, but the computer is randomizing both where the correct answer is and the order of the items in the test. So that's something that computers can do for us. Computer adaptive testing actually means that the computer is actually going to choose items as it moves forward. The GRE, which is the Graduate Record Exam, a test that is used for people wanting to go to grad school, is an example of a computer adaptive test. In this case, as you answer each question, if you get it right, you're given a harder question. If you get that one right, you're given even a harder question. However, if you get it wrong, you're given an easier question. So if you are constantly getting questions wrong, you get easier and easier questions. And the overall score is basically a normative score compared to everyone else that took that test. That's all being done automatically before your score is ever kicked out. So the advantage of computer-based testing, greater access to potential test users so you can take the test wherever. Scoring interpretation tends to be a lot quicker compared to paper and pencil versions where they have to be scored. Costs tend to be lower, so it's very easy to set up a test and have as many people take it whenever they want. And it facilitates testing otherwise in isolated personality or populations and people with disabilities. So you can take laptops to people and make them available and allow people to take tests in lots of different settings. So there's a lot of advantages to computer-based testing. So some final concepts that I want to cover before we move on to our third lecture set, and that is professional considerations. Those administering tests must meet certain qualifications depending on the test given. So example, for an academic setting, your university has determined that basically people that are teaching these classes need to have some pre-experience teaching, and they also need a certain degree in the field that they are teaching. So professionals' use of educational and psychological tests require that all test administrators follow the following. One, maintain the security of the testing materials before and after testing. In other words, they do not make the tests available to people, and they do not present the test or publish the test to where they can be found. Avoid labeling individuals based on a single test score. Adhere strictly to the copyright laws and under no circumstance photocopy or otherwise reproduce answer forms, test booklets, or manuals. Administer and score tests exactly as specified in the manual, according to the rules, and release the results only to authorized personnel in the form of keeping with accepted principles or test implementations. So this is basically kind of the accepted rules of a test person giving the test. So I, as someone giving a test in this class, I maintain the security of the test materials. So I am not allowing them out. I do not make them available on websites. And I hope that you aren't doing that either. I'm avoiding labeling individuals based on a single test score. So if someone scores lowly on the first test, I'm not immediately assuming that they're going to be bad at the rest of the class. There might be a lot of reasons they didn't do well on that first test, and they may very well improve on others. I want to make sure that the tests I'm giving are not actually stolen from other locations. And I'm also not reproducing other tests. I'm using a test that I've created. I want to administer and score the test exactly as specified in the manual. In this case, I've already told you how many items are in each test. I've set up the rules and I've set up the score. Each test is worth 100 points. And I will not release those tests to anyone outside of yourself and the final score to the university once you've completed the test. So you have control over your test scores. So that's pretty much just some of the things to think about as far as professional considerations, and that fits into those stakeholders. You as a test giver have professional considerations whenever you're giving a test to someone else.